I first met Marvin on the site High Five. This was a few years ago, way before they made you verify yourself. Now you have to verify your profile within a few days or you lose it, which is probably a good thing and likely happened because of all the scammers. He said he was in the military, the Army, and deployed to Afghanistan. We started to chat on the site and then he asked for my phone number. At the time I was 27 and single and I thought military guys were very hot and sexy, so there was no harm in chatting. I lived in Chicago and he said he lived in Houston and he would be deployed for 8 more months to Afghanistan. His phone number was a Houston area code and he said he was 35 years old and had been in the Army for 10 years. He told me that his father was from South Africa, as his mother as well. But then he moved to the States when his parents died in a tragic car accident. And he had an uncle who lived in Houston, which is how he ended up in the States, finished schooling, and then decided to join the Army. He had an accent that I had not spoken to anyone from that part of the world, so I had no idea how he's supposed to sound. We started this kind of flirty online phone relationship, and we exchanged emails, and went totally off a high five. He would call me late at night, and it worked out well because I worked night shift, stocking store shelves, so we would always talk on my lunch breaks. He would constantly text me flowers, poems, and lyrics to songs. He sent me video one time claiming it was him in the Army. Admittedly, I worried about him all the time. He said it was dangerous, and he hoped to take an early leave and come and visit me. I was excited to meet him. We did video chat, but it was only a few seconds of video and it was very distorted. He said it was due to his location, but we did talk every night on the phone. I was kind of falling for this rough soldier. We talked about politics and economy, all sorts of topics, and he seemed to be very intelligent. We continued our relationship, and he sent me a vacation form for me to fill out. He said since he's been away, he doesn't have access to his account, and the Army required me to fill the form out as his fiancé, and it would cost $200 to apply for his leave. He told me he could pay me back when he got to the States, and so I agreed to pay it. The money was wired into a bank account in California. He then said he was going to plan his leave, but his commander demanded he pay for his flight as he's leaving the war zone early. He asked if I could borrow $800 to pay for his flight. I did, and I ended up wiring the money again to the same person in California. He then asked me if I could buy him an iTunes card so he could stay in touch while he travels, and since I worked at a store, it was easy for me to buy a $100 iTunes card while I was at work for him. I was excited to meet him, and he told me he loved me. He sent me a photo of himself getting ready to, quote, board his plane home. Then everything went silent. I was supposed to meet him at the airport in Chicago. On the day, he didn't respond to my calls or messages. I tried again calling and texting. A few days went by and I realized I'm being stood up. I cried and blamed myself, thinking he didn't find me attractive enough. I sent him a nasty email telling him how disgusting I felt, and I wanted an explanation. After calling and texting and emailing, he finally replied. He confessed to me that his name wasn't Marvin, it was Michael. He wasn't a soldier, but a student, 25 years old from Nigeria. He sent me his real photo and told me he had totally fallen for me, and he was afraid I wouldn't want him because of his looks. At first I didn't know what to say, but he kept on with the sweet messages, and I finally accepted his phone call. He told me he scammed to pay for schooling and food, and he was very sorry. And he didn't intend to fall for me, but he did, and that's why he vanished. He felt so bad, and I told him he should have just been honest. I didn't care where he was from. I asked him if his words he told me were real, and he said yes, and he cried over the phone saying he really was in love with me. I told him I needed some time, but I told him I didn't care. I loved him for who he was and wanted to know about his whole life. We finally ended up video chatting and he showed me his home and his life. He said he'd never scammed before and he lived at home with his 2 young brothers and that his father ran off and he goes to school and supports his mother who is not well. He kept saying he was sorry and we started a real online relationship. I told him if we work out in time I would come to visit him in Nigeria. He was so excited about it. He didn't ask for money during this time we were together at first. As the months went on, we continued our relationship, and I told him next year I would come to visit. He then told me that his mother was very sick and asked me if I could send $300 for her medicine. Now keep in mind I had never video chatted with his mother. I had only seen a photograph of her. I agreed, and I didn't think much of it, as it was for a good reason, and I thought I knew the truth. Then he asked if I would be able to pay his phone bill every month, as he's having trouble finding work and keeping his phone on. As time continued, I ended up paying that and sending some money to him monthly for food. And he was a skinny man, and I could tell he didn't have a lot. He kept up with the messages, romantic songs, and did everything he did when he was his fake military persona. I thought he was genuine. He friended me with his real profile online, but his real profile only had 3 friends, 2 younger people from Nigeria, some young guys. He told me he was going to school for business and dreamed of opening his own business. We tossed back and forth about him coming to the United States to live with me, but he was hesitant. He said he wanted to flourish his business in Nigeria, his home country, to make it better. When I would mention me coming to meet him there, he became less excited. I felt some change, and the months got closer to me planning my trip. Then his messages dropped. Only a few, and I ended up emailing him my feelings. He wrote back and said he loved me, but he was ashamed of how poor he lives, and he was suffering and didn't want me to know. I asked him to explain himself, and he said that his brothers are without food. He said he couldn't send messages to me because he had to walk to a neighbor's house to charge his phone and laptop because they didn't always have electricity. My heart sunk, and I ended up wiring him $1,000 to help out. I then told him I'm going to plan my visit. He said okay, but he said he was nervous that I wouldn't like him. I told him I already love him, so stop being negative. He said he loved me when I asked. I just couldn't help but feel weird, though. We kept up the relationship, but when I mentioned my flight plans, different ideas for flying out, he would quit talking. My intuition made me do a little bit of investigating. When I checked his name in search for another profile, nothing came up. So I ended up logging onto my sister's profile, and I found Michael had another profile. What I saw shocked and broke my heart. He was married. He had 2 young kids, and he had told me those were his 2 brothers. I went through album after album, which was all wide open. He had blocked me on his real profile, so he thought I'd never find it. Then I saw photos of his wedding, with his wife and his kids, and all of them in a car. They were far from suffering and poor. They had a nicer car than I do. I saved the photos and emailed them to Michael, asking him what's going on. The kind, sweet man turned on me and told me that I was a dumb fool, and his wife bought new clothes with my American money, and his kids got new toys and shoes. He called me all sorts of names and told me I was a fool over and over again. Then he blocked my number, and he stopped replying to my emails. I can only assume he had many victims, as some of his photos showed stacks of iTunes cards and money. His wife was driving a new Toyota car and had a brand new handbag in one of his albums. It made me sick, and he likely was scamming lots of women and probably still is. I'll never know his real true story or his age, and more of what he left off was probably lies. The only info I had was his first real name and last name because I did wire him money. At least I think that was him who picked up the money. I turned his information over to the EFCC, but I've never heard a word. It's a heartbreak for me and a terrible lesson in honesty. Once a scammer, always a scammer. And we'd like to thank this lady for sharing her story, and it happens often where people end up talking to a fake profile and the person confesses and claims that they've never scammed and they want to love you as themselves, and in reality they're just scamming you as themselves now. So please be cautious and be aware. If someone's scamming, they're going to keep scamming. It's not a miracle that they just stop because they met you. If you'd like to share your story, you can find us on email, scammingscammers@gmail.com. We are also back on Facebook under Scamming Scammers Cyber Education. You can drop us a message there as well. We'll verify your story and narrate it into a video. Thanks for listening, and until next time.